Everybody, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today for a very special program. Throughout this academic year, at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, we have been posing the question of where next on climate, which is quite important in view of some of the changes in policy orientation that have happened in the United States. In this context, we are delighted to have with us the Honorable Catherine McKenna, the Minister for Environment and Climate Change from Canada, for a town hall discussion with students here and also with an audience that is watching through our live stream. Now, in the United States and in Canada and elsewhere around the globe, throughout the kind of modern environmental period, there has been a recurrent debate over a perceived competition between economic development on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. In the United States, we're now in a new phase of this debate with an administration that has made a series of policy choices about removing regulations that were put in place to protect the environment, about removal of the United States, so is the declared intention, from the Paris Climate Agreement, and other such decisions. Now, our Canadian neighbors have also experienced long and at times acrimonious debates over the interaction between environmental and economic goals. Canada's is a very diverse economy, of course, but one significant element of that economy is natural resource development. So this issue, which has long been a feature of policymaking and priority setting in both of our countries, again, is important. Catherine McKenna was elected as the first female member of Parliament for Ottawa Centre on October 19th, 2015, and she was appointed Minister of Environment and Climate Change shortly thereafter. She helped to negotiate the Paris Agreement on climate change and secured Canada's first plan with the provinces, territories, and Indigenous peoples to address climate change and grow a clean economy. Before entering politics, Minister McKenna practiced competition and international trade law with leading firms in Canada and Indonesia. She was senior negotiator with the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission on the Timor Sea Treaty. She has also worked in the nonprofit sector with founding an organization called Level Justice that seeks to increase access to justice for marginalized communities worldwide. She's a graduate of the University of Toronto, London School of Economics, and McGill Law School, and is a member of the bar in Ontario, and as I understand it, also the state of New York. Crazy thing that is.
Got my shingle in New York.
That's right. Excellent. So before I turn over the floor to Minister McKenna, let me make a few organizational comments. First, the point of this town hall is for you in the audience to have an opportunity to hear from and to pose questions to Minister McKenna, so please start thinking about your questions that will come to in the course of the program. Second, like all events that we run at the Center on Global Energy Policy, this event is being webcast live. Both the full video and a podcast recording will be available on our website and iTunes in the coming days. And last, those of you who are watching online, as well as people here in the audience, if you are so inclined, this will show the generational divide, you can submit a question at any time using the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle at ColumbiaUEnergy. So join me, please, in welcoming Minister Catherine McKenna to this town hall.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John. Well, it's really great to be here. Any Canadians in the audience? Look at that. Of course they're Canadians. Hopefully some Canadians watching online as well. Well, it's certainly great to be here at the Center for Global Energy Policy. A shout out to my friend Jason Bordoff, who's lurking in the back. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important conversation on the environment and the economy. And that's really what my job is. It's not finding a balance, because I don't believe in work-life balance. We try to do a lot at the same time and get good outcomes. And it's the same when it comes to taking action on climate change. I say I'm as much the Minister of Environment and of Economy as I am as the Minister of the Environment. And you have to be by necessity. That you have to be thinking about jobs. You have to be thinking about economic growth. But that's not inconsistent with taking action on climate change. And in fact, if you look, and I'll talk a bit more about this and happy to answer questions, if you don't think about the economic impacts of climate change, which are now, we're in the billions, verging on the trillions of dollars of the cost of extreme weather events, then you're going to miss the plot. And people, there are lots of folks who might say, well, it's expensive to do things. It's expensive not to act on climate change. It's really expensive. It's expensive now, and then the debt we're passing on to our kids is huge. And I have 3 kids, so I think about that a lot. But you can get it right. And I think in Canada, you know what, there's still live debates, and I'm sure some of the Canadians might raise some questions or know about the debates that go on about, on the one hand, the environment, and the other hand, the economy, and how they can't go together. I actually think that we spend a lot of time thinking about smart policy and how do we ensure that they are consistent. So there's me. I'm not sure exactly when that was, but it could have been when when I first took the job. So 2 days on the job. So I was very excited. I was asked to be the first ever Minister of Environment and Climate Change. So that put a big signal to the world that Canada was going to take climate change seriously. But I was in the Paris talks. So I literally didn't know what a COP was. I was like, what is this COP thing? Why is everyone using these acronyms? So I just asked. So they were like, conference of parties. I said, great, okay, great. So I know one thing now. But I went to the talks, and it was just an amazing time to be there. A lot of people had put a lot of work, many decades in trying to get serious action on climate change. And we were able to get an ambitious Paris Agreement. And I was actually really proud. I helped negotiate the market tax, so Article 6, if you're really nerdy, you can go look it up. It sounds a bit incoherent. It's because some folks couldn't actually recognize that markets have a role in the world, but it actually allows for trading. And so I do think markets, and we can talk more about that too, markets are really important, and making sure that we're driving not billions but trillions into to clean growth is going to be critical. So why do I say this picture makes me really happy? So this picture is in a place called Tadirutup, which is Inuktitut for Lancaster Sound. So it's in the high Arctic. I'm here with an Inuit elder. He helps build canoes with Inuit youth, helping reconnect to their culture and their heritage. And this was really special. We announced we were protecting 2% of our oceans when we created the Marine Conservation in Lancaster Sound. We also were in partnership with Inuit. But there's a story behind the story. So I was on a ship, and on the ship we had climate scientists from Environment and Climate Change Canada, great public servants. Some of them are here. I'm looking at, we had Inuit youth. We actually had young people from around the world. I had my daughters. And we had Inuit elders. And so we've been on the ship, and it was amazing because we were going to the high Arctic, we're going to national parks, we were having discussions about Inuit culture and the relationship with the land, looking at the impacts of climate change. And a 14-year-old boy came up to me, and he said to me, he was quite quiet, and he said, do you have a minute? I just want to talk to you about what I think are impacts of climate change that I'm seeing in my community. So he's from Cambridge Bay, high Arctic. So I said, sure. So I said, let me get a climate scientist, because I said, let's get someone who really knows if these are effects of climate change. And so we got a climate scientist. We found a little corner of our boat. And he said, so when I go hunting, my feet are getting stuck in like quicksand. The permafrost is thawing. And then he said, when we go hunting, a lot is around hunting for country food. So he said, when we go hunting for caribou, we can't find them anymore, that the caribou are literally disappearing. And then he said, and then the polar bears are a lot thinner. And then the thing that really, those were all really devastating, especially after spending this time in the boat where Inuit really are so connected to the land, the water, the ice, the animals. But he said, a number of my friends have lost their dads because their dad, they go out hunting and they fall through the ice. And these are hunters, that have passed on, the tradition of hunting and being able to tell the thickness of ice, passed on for millennia, and they can't do it anymore. So you lose a father, a brother, a hunter, a provider, a community member. And so the climate scientists said, yeah, these are all signs of climate change. And I tell that story because I think it's time to keep it real. You talk about 2030 targets, and if you're at the international climate negotiations, you're talking about differentiation and the pathway to 100 billion. I mean, those are all important topics, but really we're talking about what kind of planet do we want? And we're talking about people. And we're talking about lives. And that's just really important, my job, because you can get caught up in the rhetoric. And let me tell you, if you're on my Twitter feed right now, at McKenna, people are fighting it out right now as we speak. The environment, the economy, they call me all sorts of names or whatever. But it's really about making sure that you're grounded and you're thinking about people. Because people, they care about the environment and they care about jobs. And if you keep that, and you always keep that in mind, you will be able to come to a decent spot. Not everyone's going to agree, and you're going to have to make tough choices sometimes. But that's okay, because you're going to be doing what people expect. So there we are. Yay! We got an ambitious Paris Agreement. It was pretty awesome. I would love to tell you the story of women on climate. Women really are kicking it on climate, and I actually think we wouldn't have an ambitious Paris Agreement if we didn't have people like Laurence Toubiana. So she was the French climate ambassador. Christiana Figueres. So Laurence Toubiana wore different colored Converse, and so I feel like they're all my superhero friends. So she was like the stylish French woman, and Christiana Figueres was like the pint size, energetic, no BS, negotiator. We had Mary Robinson. So Mary Robinson was the president of Ireland, also head of the UN on Human Rights. Who was really focused on the human rights aspect of acting on climate. You had Sharon Burrows, who was like the hardcore, I always forget her name, Rosie the Riveter. So she's like the hardcore fighting for labor and people and jobs. And everyone was really pushing the envelope. And I thought what was really cool about women, so this is a bit of a divergence, but I think it's important, is that women could see the big picture. And I'm not saying, I know men care about climate change, but often they got into this stupid zero-sum game. I get this, you don't get this. And the women would just kind of keep it real. They'd be like, okay, you know what? We can get an agreement and it's going to suck. Or we can be ambitious and really push the envelope and listen to the folks in the small island states that are literally going to be underwater if we don't stay well under 2 degrees. So anyway, this was the great news story. When I went Paris Climate Talks, I was able to say, and I was like the first international meeting for any member of our cabinet. And so I got to sit down and say, we believe the science behind climate change. We believe that we need to be working together in the international community. We want an ambitious Paris Agreement, and Canada's back. And I was like, yay, everyone's so happy Canada's back. So that was awesome, right? You get to come kind of at the tail end and get this agreement. But then we had to come home, and then it was basically the Paris Agreement negotiations in Canada. And that's interesting that, John, you pointed out, our country is very diverse. So we have a small island state, Prince Edward Island, receding by 48 centimeters a year. And then we have Alberta, where you have the oil sands. There's a whole range of different provinces with different profiles of the economy. And we have a large natural resource base. And we had a government for 10 years who did nothing. Nothing on climate action. In fact, may sound like something you've heard before, but you couldn't really say the words climate change. That was a big change, but you had to get a national climate plan. And in a federation, that is hard. So for those of you who are Canadians, every province is different and everyone has their own vision. And so we spent a year negotiating this climate plan. And there we are. This is the very end. You have all the premiers, and you have our national Indigenous organizations, so Inuit, Métis, and First Nations, who represent it, and we got a plan after a year. So what is the plan? There's many elements of a plan. So when you have to come up with a climate plan and meet a target, especially if for 10 years you're had a government who did nothing on your target, so it becomes increasingly harder. If you have a 2030 target, 10 years go by, so you have to reduce your emissions. How do you do that? You have to do it across the board. So some of the features of our climate plan, putting a price on pollution. So a number of provinces already have a price on pollution, but we said there has to be a price across the board in every province, and it has to go up. For a price to be effective, it just has to go up. Starts at $10 and goes to $50 by 2022. We said we were phasing out coal. And a big shout out to Alberta. Any Albertans here? So Alberta, we've got my chief of staff, he's from Alberta. But Alberta, Alberta gets a rough ride. Alberta, we wouldn't have a national climate plan, actually, if it wasn't for Alberta, because the first time ever you had a government that announced they were putting a price on pollution, that was phasing out coal. So we phased out coal. They had announced they were phasing out coal. We made the decision to do that across the country by 2030 and put a hard cap on emissions from the oil sands. Those are pretty brave things. We're in a transition. It's not going to happen overnight. And they recognize that, but at the same time, they took serious action. So first time ever, you had a government in Alberta doing that, which really helped accelerate some of the things we did. So as I said, price on pollution, phasing out coal. We brought in a clean fuel standard, which is going to actually get a huge reduction in emissions. But it really is across the board. You have to have, we have a new net zero building standard. You have to look at the transportation sector. I mean, really, you just have to model, and then you have to figure out the politics if possible. And so that's what we did. It also includes historic investments in clean technologies, because you need to be helping folks that have the solutions. So from their garage, basement, to the labs, all the way to exporting their technologies. And then, of course, there's adaptation, because we are seeing significant impacts across the country. So this is our climate plan, so it was a lot of work. I was really, really happy. It was like 1 year later. It was amazing. We got a climate plan. So here I am. You're like, what's going on here? It's a hydrogen fuel cell bus. This is in China. So you might say, well, why am I talking about China? Because China is actually all in on climate action. I went to China. We have an annual kind of a meeting. It's called the China Council. And I also have bilateral meetings with my counterparts in China. And basically they said to me, come to us with your clean air, clean water, clean soil solutions. So every time I go to China, I come with a trade mission with Canadian companies that have solutions. And when you look at the scale of what's happening in China, if you look at, I think they're installing an equivalent of a football field of solar panels every hour. If you look at the scale of EVs, they've really, the commitment to EVs, including through Didi, which Didi bought out Uber in China. I mean, the scale is just so huge. And that actually moves the dial. And maybe once again, we'll come back to that, because it's about markets and it's about prices going down, and they have a huge role to play. So this is supposed to represent the U.S. So the U.S., there's a lot going on in the U.S. I mean, there's a lot of focus on this administration's decision to say they're going to pull out of the Paris Agreement. You actually can't notify until 2019 formally pulling out. It's 2020, the day after the next election. But it is also, there's a lot going on in the United States. Of course, I worked extremely closely with the Obama administration. But now I spend a lot of time with states like California and Governor Brown, all in on climate action. And as I tell everyone in Canada, California isn't like any other state. It's the 6th largest economy in the world. So that's big. There's scale there. Mayors, I was just in Miami as well as Houston, so they were hit by they were hit by a hurricane, so they understand the coastal resilience and the importance of coastal resilience. But even in a place like Houston, the mayor is all in. He's one of the climate mayors. And they've been able to diversify their economy and businesses. So there's a lot of momentum in the business community. And that's everyone from, you might say the Silicon Valley folks, of course. But it's like Mars, it's Anheuser-Busch, it's Goldman Sachs, it's BlackRock. And so that's really big, that you have actually seen folks that were less actively involved, or at least less prominent in the climate discussions, because so much focus was on countries. And as I say, when we got the Paris Agreement, it was a signal to the market. You had 195 countries saying, yeah, climate change is real and we got to take real action. And so as a result, not surprisingly, you see businesses seeing opportunities, and you see mayors who are on the front lines of climate change, and governors really stepping up. Anyone know who that guy is? Michael Bloomberg, yes. So he's been a really great partner for us. We've been working really closely with him on a number of initiatives, including phasing out coal. So the market has moved on coal, so natural gas is actually cheaper. And in the US context, there's 5 times as many jobs in wind and solar than there are in coal. And part of that is automation, as I say, part of that is just market moving to natural gas being cheaper. But internationally, we are working really hard to looking at how we can support countries that want to get off coal, but there might be a bit of a price differential. So they want to get off coal to go to renewables, but it's a little bit more expensive. And so we're working with the World Bank. Canada's investing our money with World Bank financing to help support countries. And the Powering Past Coal Coalition was something that Canada started with the UK. And so it's kind of cool because everyone thinks of the UK and they think coal, but actually the UK is going to be out of coal by 2022, so completely coal-free in its electricity system, and there's a lot of interest in this. A lot of businesses have joined on too. So technology, this is the exciting part. Innovation. Like, who doesn't like innovation? Every country wants to innovate. Everyone wants to create new jobs. And so there are so many awesome innovations out there. This is called, I was going to say Carbon Cure. It's called, someone on my team, Marla, what's it called? It's in the X Prize, not Carbon Cure, Carbon Engineering. So they're actually sucking emissions out and using it to produce, to actually produce things. So that's the new frontier. The new frontier is taking what you don't want, waste, so CO2, and actually producing something that you do want. So another example is a company called Carbon Cure. So it's a company that was started, actually, you guys can do this too. It was just a student at McGill. He was doing his master's, and he was given this challenge by his engineering prof. He said, okay, well, why don't you figure out how you can inject CO2 into cement to make it cheaper and stronger. So that is what he did. So I was just in California at a cement factory, pretty glam. My hard hat on, and looking at this technology, this innovation he has, where he actually takes out CO2 from industry, which you don't want. Obviously, you don't want to go into the air, and he takes it and injects it into cement. Cheaper, stronger. Who doesn't like that? Cheaper and stronger. That's good. So these are the opportunities. And anyone heard of Mark Carney, governor of the Bank of England? Used to be the governor of the Bank of Canada. He talks about it being a $30 trillion opportunity. That we're in the clean growth century. And so the countries and the businesses that figure this out are going to be the ones that are going to be able to create good jobs, who are going to be able to innovate, who are going to be able to create the solutions that we all desperately need, both in our own countries, but also abroad. So what is this? This is me at a press conference. We'll play a little clip.
Christopher Wilson, Rebel Media. My question's for Minister McKenna. Thank you very much for being here today. What does the federal government believe the role of hydroelectricity is, whether it's Site C or other hydro projects across the country, in providing clean power, especially as we see cities like Vancouver phase out fossil fuels for increased electrification?
So you're the Rebel Media that happens to call me Climate Barbie. I certainly hope that you will no longer use that hashtag.
Me personally, I never have, Minister.
Just saying Rebel Media. So can I get a commitment from you that you will not use that hashtag and not use that name in your articles?
Well, me personally, yes, but I don't
Just
have
for
editorial
Rebel
control
Media,
of others.
please?
But if you want to get into it right now, you actually banned one of our correspondents from going to the upcoming conference in Bonn. So how
That
come
is
you did
not
that?
true. In fact, I wrote a letter last year encouraging you to come because I think that you can all learn about climate change, how it's
Absolutely.
real and it's having real
I have
impacts.
a legitimate question about hydroelectricity's role.
I just would like a commitment that you will not call me names, that you won't talk about the color of my hair, that you won't make fun of me. And the reason I'm asking you not to do this is because I have 2 daughters.
All right.
That there are lots of girls that want to get into politics, and it is completely unacceptable that you do this. That
What
you
I
can
find
be a legitimate
unacceptable is when you smear
organization.
people calling them deniers with all the connotations of the Holocaust denial, okay? There is
All right, I think we're
Now, if
done.
you
Okay, even though I'm it's painful to watch. So why am I putting that up? Because I think we can't not talk about the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is it's hard. This is hard. Like, as I say, go to my Twitter feed, but it's a hard conversation. And it often becomes really polarizing. And unfortunately, actually, and there's a number of women who are working in the climate field, there's also weird misogynistic aspect. So if you go right now, Google climate Barbie, whatever, you'll see there's many people who have memes and it's hilarious, haha. But it is important that we recognize that we have to figure this out for folks. And I'm not, of course we have to call people names. That's just unacceptable. But it's a weird polarizing conversation. And sometimes I just lie in bed at night trying to think about why would people not acknowledge that climate change is real? It's a really big problem. I mean, if, it's like you're a kid and you're gonna put your head under the pillow and pretend you didn't do something bad. That's not gonna solve anything. And so, I mean, what I try to do, and I know there's a lot of women, there's a great woman to follow, Catherine Hayhoe, so she's actually Canadian, but she works in the US, and she talks often to kind of more religious communities about climate change and the science, is just figuring out how we reach people. And how do we kind of fight back against this narrative that climate change isn't real? And that doesn't mean you're going to convince everyone, but you do have to convince a critical mass of people that climate change is real, it's a really big problem, but we have solutions, and we can actually do it, and we can, have intelligent conversations and debates about policy. In Canada, a legitimate debate, it's a little bit harder now, but the Conservatives in Canada, there was a good debate going on about whether you don't regulate, you just have a price on pollution. So as I said, our price is going up to $50. But there was a candidate who was running for the leadership of our Conservative Party who said the price should just be, forget about regulation, no regulation, go up to $300. And the market will figure it out because people will innovate and you don't have to regulate. That's an intelligent, that's a good conversation. I'm a policy wonk. I kind of like that conversation. I think it's very hard as a politician to say we're going to go up to $300 because it's not that it doesn't make sense. It's just hard for people to compute. You would obviously have to think about the impacts on lower income folks and trade exposed sectors and all that. But unfortunately, you often are in this conversation, which is a weird conversation. I decided to call this guy out because I was like, okay, I'm in a meeting with environment ministers and you're the guys that are call me Climate Barbie on Twitter. We need to get beyond that. So I don't know how we do this. There's just a broader conversation about talking about climate change and talking about a science and doing it in a respectful way and recognizing that there are jobs. As people, there's a transition going on. So, coal, if people are moving after coal, people need jobs. People need jobs. And you won't get the support you need as a politician if you don't care about jobs. And there is some people that are on the other hand, so this is on, on one hand there'll be folks who say, can't do any climate action, either climate change isn't real or it's too expensive to do anything. And the other side that I also have to contend with are folks who are over now, no fossil fuels right now. And that's also really hard. First of all, people are still driving cars that aren't electric vehicles. People are still going and buying lots of clothes, going to H&M or whatever and buying clothes and throwing them out. People are still using single-use plastics. There are a lot of challenges. And so you also need to be realistic and you have to bring people along and you have to be thoughtful about smart policy. And it's just not good enough to say too bad for the folks that might be in these jobs we're transitioning right now. Because I don't think, one, it doesn't work because people are still driving cars, so you still have the demand, but also it's just forgetting that there are real people. And, I get hit on both sides. Luckily, I'm pretty tough. So, it's fine. Getting called names isn't okay because I don't want other people to have to go through that. But it's hard. So that's what I think we all need to think about, is how do we talk about taking climate action in a thoughtful way that also translates it into real things. It's not 2030 targets. No one knows what you're talking about. Except if you're in the Paris climate talks. But it's about the future we want. It's about making sure we have a sustainable future, but making sure we're growing our economies and we have good jobs and that we're innovating and that we're working together. But trying to make it real is always it's the tension, and trying to fight against extremes is also something that I try to do. And it's really hard. It's really hard because people come from different perspectives and in different places and different parts of the country. But at the end of the day, that's what I know Canadians expect. And I think that that's what people around the world expect. They expect leadership. They expect people being able to try to figure this out and be thoughtful. And I also really believe that people understand that the environment and the economy go together. That you don't get the economy if you forget about the environment, because you go off a cliff and you destroy things that actually have real value. But you also, you don't get the environment if you don't care about jobs. So there you have it. Happy now to chat. Actually, I don't know what else I have here, so I probably, whatever. I think let's not end on this slide. I feel like it's fine. When I watched that, I'm like, I was really mad, and it was like a split-second decision, but...
More power to you.
Yeah, and there's some other... Well, that was a former minister who was a politician. I landed on that one. So this is kind of me owning. I decided, like, we're not going with the Climate Barbie, we're going with the Climate Crusader, so this is Halloween. Sometimes you also have to just laugh. It's not like you can't always be super serious about things. Great.
Right. So we are now going to shift over to the Q&A portion of our program. For those of you who are watching online and listening to the podcast, let me say what I should have said at the outset, which is that my name is Jonathan Elkind. I'm with the Center on Global Energy Policy and previously served as Assistant Secretary of Energy during the Obama administration, looking after international affairs. So in that context, had the pleasure of dealing with colleagues from Canada a great deal. If you are here in person, in a couple of seconds, I'll invite you to come to the microphone. If you have a question, please formulate it as a question. And if you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself at the outset. For those of you who are watching online, you can use the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy if you want to pass a question into the hall. So just to get things started, if I could, I'd like to ask you, Catherine, a question to elaborate a little bit on some of what the component parts are of the Pan-Canadian framework that you referred to. Canada is a very diverse economy, and what you need in Nova Scotia in terms of energy is not going to be the same as what you need in Vancouver, the metropolitan area. So. How has the Canadian approach to climate accommodated the need for flexibility and differentiation among your different provinces and territories and so forth?
So that's a really great question, because the reality is, in Canada, the federal government can't just come in and say, okay, folks, here's our climate plan, boom. It doesn't work like that. And so we're a federation, you got to work with the provinces. We also have to work with Indigenous peoples, and we have to work with business, and we have to work with environmentalists and Canadians. And so that's what a lot of the time was spent doing when we were negotiating our climate plan. Like, we have 4 provinces who are on coal. So if you're on coal and we're phasing out coal, you better be figuring out some solutions, right? So we had conversations about that, like whether it's interties between provinces. So if you have clean energy, that you can supply other provinces. It is, if you look at electric vehicles, it's so diverse, our country. Electric vehicles, there's some parts of our country where the distances are massive. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, and the technology isn't there. We have Indigenous communities that are on diesel. Like, we need to help them get off diesel. They don't want to be on diesel. They want to be on something cleaner, but they also want to have jobs, and they don't want someone coming in and imposing it. So you just had to figure that out. In some cases, you can just say, okay, we're going to, reduce methane emissions by 40 to 45% from the oil and gas sector, and you can do that, and that's across the board, and we're the regulator. But in other cases, you just have to be really thoughtful, and you have to figure out the politics. And there's a lot of politics in politics. So I don't know if you can see me in the back, so maybe I'll stand. But, we have, in some provinces, we have changes in government, and that causes tension. You can have a government who's really all in on climate change, and the next one isn't. So that's hard. But, the approach, though, and you might appreciate this, it is very helpful. I don't have all the tools, even in the federal government. Like, I don't control transportation. Putting a price on carbon pollution requires the finance minister. The infrastructure, when we build infrastructure, if we're going to be building social housing, you better be building energy efficient social housing so the poorest people aren't paying the most. And obviously your natural resource minister. You can't have the natural resource ministers all about, fossil fuels all the time. So luckily, the Prime Minister said from the top, climate change is serious and we're all in this together. So there is no divide, and I don't think you've ever seen it, certainly not in Canada's context, where you have the energy minister and the environment minister, as he always says, we're hand in hand. The environment and the economy go hand in hand, and everyone laughs because in Canada we say that all the time. But it's a check. It's a check that I always need to remember about, the economy and jobs, and he always needs to remember the climate, that we got to be taking serious climate action. And so that's really helped. We just announced our new environmental assessment review for major projects. So that's projects like pipelines, hydro dams, it could be large-scale renewables, mines. And that we took that approach to it too. That we need to figure out the transition, so you can't be, approving projects without thinking about what are the climate impacts, what are the emissions. And you have to be, smart about, you want to foster the best technology. And you also kind of want to limit all the friction. And I'm actually a believer when people talk, when you bring unusual suspects together, it's just a lot better. So one of the things that we did, that we brought in with our new environmental assessment process, was this early engagement phase, where companies are sitting down with Indigenous people, sitting down with communities and talking it out. Because I was finding that people were getting big big boxes of documents on their desk and trying to figure out, what does this project mean for my community? And at that point, it's kind of a lot of it has been decided. And meanwhile, on the other hand, you have companies that are making billion-dollar decisions and then finding out actually there's some problems that could have been addressed earlier. So we're figuring that out. Projects need to fit in with our national climate plan, so we're looking at a strategic assessment that would take that into account. And I guess my point is really, when you do anything, it has to be consistent. You can't have, on the one hand, we're just going to build all these infrastructure projects and not thinking about the climate impacts, or we're not looking at the financial tools. We have committed to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, you have to be looking at the whole package, otherwise it doesn't make sense. And then Canadians can legitimately say, what are you talking about? You don't believe in the environment and the economy, or you might, but you don't. And so it has been across the board, but it requires the top. Okay. So the big boss has said, he said the environment and the economy go together, and he said climate change, we need a national plan. So
I have to say, for a visitor to New York who didn't bat an eye on either one of the sirens going past, that's quite a...
I used to live in Indonesia.
Okay. So just one more question for me, real quick, and then I'd like to open up. I'd be remiss if I didn't take advantage of your past professional focus on trade to pose a question about the U.S.-Canada trade in the NAFTA context. NAFTA has, of course, special provisions that relate to environmental protection. Have they been effective? Are the interests of North Americans generally favored by a continuation of NAFTA or by something different?
So NAFTA, who knows about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement? How many U.S. jobs rely on this, on NAFTA? At least 3 million. And we can go state by state. We have representatives, our consul general here, our ambassador to the UN. We're all talking about how trade is good. We believe trade is really good and it's really important, and it's not a zero-sum game. It's extremely good for Americans and Canadians and Mexicans. On the environment side, so as we go through the renegotiation of NAFTA, there's an environment chapter. The U.S. has said that they want an environment chapter within NAFTA. So right now there's a side agreement. So that's good. So we all agree. Canada, the U.S., and Mexico agree that there needs to be an environment chapter. Of course, devil is in the details. Has it been effective? I think it's been somewhat effective. I mean, why would you have an environment chapter? So the Prime Minister said we want progressive trade. that we want to include labor standards, we want to include environment standards, we want to be thinking about Indigenous people and gender. It's because if you get good deals, if you have a trade agreement that respects the environment, you're going to attract investment because it is actually a competitive advantage. You don't want it to be like you got terrible environmental standards and people just come pillage, and that's your added benefit. And so in NAFTA, I think that everyone agrees it should be, we should have strong environmental standards. That you don't want people to be going to a jurisdiction just because they have low standards. So we're working on that. We've also been clear that every country needs to have the right to regulate. So if you're regulating, for example, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that shouldn't be seen as a trade barrier or a non-tariff trade barrier. And then there's the elephant in the room, climate change. We've said Canada and Mexico have said that we need to be reflecting, the need to act on climate change and the opportunity of clean growth. And that's what trade's about. Trade is about how do we grow our economies. And so, we're having a discussion about that. That's obviously a political level discussion. But I think, I think it's important. I think we just negotiated, the new CTPPP, so the Comprehensive Progressive Trade Pacific Partnership. Got it? And that also has a really strong environment chapter, and then also with the CETA, the Canada-European Free Trade Agreement also. So I think that trade agreements need to reflect this idea that it's a race to the top on the environment and you want to have strong standards.
Excellent. Okay, so now I'm looking to you in the audience who may have questions. Please approach the microphone and let's take a couple of questions at a time. Make them as compact as you can, please. Just start with an introduction.
We got some online folks too. I don't know, is anyone online? Hopefully.
Please, fire away.
Hello, thanks for being here with us today. I'm a student at CEPA, focusing on energy and environment. I have a two-part question about the trans...
All right, we're just going to do one question,
okay.
one-parters, right? So
right,
keep it going. We got a long line behind you.
In the context of the new environmental assessment, and in the context of what you mentioned about the trade-off between economic growth and environmental protection, can you comment on the Alberta-BC dispute about the Trans Mountain pipeline? Thanks.
Sure. Do I want to take a few questions?
Yeah.
Okay, because we do have a long lineup. Okay.
Padma?
Thank you, Minister McKenna. My name is Padma Tata, currently studying at CEPA, previously worked with Enbridge in Ontario and relying on NAFTA to stay in the country. My question is actually also related to the new environmental assessment process and the replacement of the National Energy Board. You've already commented on it, so I guess more specifically, what are the improvements that you envision as part of kind of emission standards that go above and beyond what's currently being managed at the provincial level?
Mm-hmm. Great.
One more. Hi, my name is Cynthia. I'm the Associate Director of the MA Program in Climate and Society from Ottawa. Go Ottawa.
Woohoo! Ottawa Centre?
No, sorry, Ottawa East.
Well, you're not living there anyway. So.
Yeah, exactly. Anyways, I'm curious about, it kind of verges on the first question that was asked, but how you design climate policy. It's a long-term problem, so it's policy that kind of has to be, have a long-term vision, but also has to be adaptable as far as, as targets move, but also, as we talked about earlier, between provinces and between different changes in leadership. So how you just sort of, have that continuity as you go along.
All right, so those are three really good questions. So in terms of what's happening between BC and Alberta, so it's around the twinning of an existing pipeline. I guess this is where, you see the environment and the economy kind of, there's a perceived clash, but I think that is not true. So in terms of this project, we approved the project, the federal government approved it, and we did it in the context of three things. And this is really important because people are like, wait a minute, you said you've improved your environmental assessment system, it was under your old system. Well, one, you got to go. You can't have people start at the starting line. That doesn't make sense, and you won't create certainty in a system if every time your government changes, you throw everything into crisis. But we were very clear that we had to be consistent with our policies. So we announced, I announced with the Minister of Natural Resources, transitional principles governing environmental assessments. They did say no project goes back to the starting line, but we did say we would be looking at emissions that we would be doing, we expected robust consultations with communities that needed to be made in partnership with Indigenous peoples, and decisions needed to be made on robust science. The second thing we did is we negotiated our national climate plan. And as I say, Alberta was a really important part of that climate plan. And putting a hard cap on emissions from the oil sands is not trivial. And there is a government, not a government, but other parties that are not committed to climate action and who've said like they're going to fight to the death on things like carbon pricing. It's strange to me because it's actually a conservative, small c conservative principle. But that was important, our national climate plan. And then the third thing was our oceans protections plan. So people in British Columbia, obviously they care greatly about the coastlines, the oceans, so do we. And so we made a historic investment in a oceans protection plan. And it was in that context that we approved this project. British Columbia has raised concerns. They're not, they haven't taken particular action, although they've indicated that they're going to take action that would potentially affect the pipeline, the twinning of the pipeline. And so we have said that this is clearly federal jurisdiction. We made a decision. We took into account like the factors, whether it's oceans or climate. So we've been clear as a federal government, we're working behind the scenes to solve this. It's federation, so you're always going to have issues like this. And at the end of the day, national government has to we have to make decisions in the national interest. And we believe a national climate plan is in the national interest, and we believe this project is in the national interest, and we believe protecting our oceans is in the national interest. Number 2 and 3 are kind of related. So environmental assessments, but more broadly, how do you deal with climate and changing circumstances? So I mentioned a bit in terms of the environmental assessments. So we have a number of ways that we look at the climate impacts of a particular project. It has to fit within our national plan. We have said that we're going to do a strategic assessment. So this is a bit nerdy. If you do environmental assessments, you would understand this. But each project, if you just look at a particular project, you're not going to get like, what are the emissions in Canada overall? If you approve all of these projects, you're just looking at one project. So you have to have a broader approach so you can, kind of contextualize a particular project in the plan. So we're working on that. And we also want to see the best available technology, because if you electrify, for example, a project, you're going to have a much smaller emissions profile. But that, as I said, relates to everything we do on climate. First of all, you have to keep on modeling, because circumstances are going to change. And you have assumptions. You have assumptions based on the price of oil that, build into your forecasts. You're going to have new technologies. You're going to have changed circumstances. And you have to have a degree of flexibility, recognizing particular provincial circumstances. And so it's an insufficient answer, but you can't really do it without looking at each sort of way we've tackled it, whether it's regulation, whether it's focused on the innovation piece and what we're funding on the innovation side, or what investments we're making in provinces to help support them if they're getting off coal. But, it's hard. It's hard. Luckily, I have really smart people that are way smarter than me that work in Environment and Climate Change Canada and public servants that help us figure this out. And then I spend a lot of time talking to folks. I spend a lot of time talking to industry. I spend a lot of time talking to environmentalists, Indigenous peoples, provinces, because that's the only way you can figure this out. And that's the only way you can also try to figure out where the tensions are and get to a good spot.
Good afternoon, Minister McKenna. My name is Justice from Toronto, Canada. And you mentioned working very closely with the Obama administration. In light of the change of administration, can you talk about how Canada's federal government is now forging relationships and collaborations with American states and municipalities?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Minister McKenna. I'm Tony. I'm an undergraduate student at Columbia University, and actually I've met you at the UNFCCC COP23 in Bonn, Germany.
Wow, okay, and I think I met Justice too. Oh my gosh,
okay, that's interesting.
All right.
So my question is that, could you please elaborate a little bit more, since you have talked about China in your lecture? So how is the Canadian-Chinese government cooperation and negotiation in the global climate change conferences, especially when President Trump is pulling U.S. out of the Paris Agreement? Thank you.
Great.
And I'll do just a quick interruption to say that thank you for your question. The gentleman who's now the last will unfortunately have to be our last questions. These two people, and then we'll call it a day. Go ahead.
Hi, Minister McKenna. I'm Risalat. I'm a student at CEPA in the Environmental Science and Policy program. I didn't have the privilege of meeting in Paris, but I was there.
All right, great.
Yeah, so that was great.
We passed in the
That was a great
always.
experience. So I wanted to ask you about, when you were talking about the carbon price, and you mentioned that it's gone from $10 and it's going to $50 by 2022. So one of the reasons that the European emissions trading system has been critiqued, that it did not maybe have the intended effect, is because the price wasn't high enough. So I just wanted to hear more from you about, are you happy with the price that was ultimately negotiated with the different ministries, and do you think it will be effective in actually having the intended effects? Thank you.
Great.
Hi, thanks for everything. And my name is Nicolas. I'm originally from Chile. I'm doing a double degree program from CIENSPO and Columbia here, and MPA, Master in Public Administration. And my question was related with that on last January, Canada announced the creation of this independent watchdog of Canadian off-board things. And do you think this will have this institution will have the force or the teeth to enforce Canadian standards to offshore operations in other countries? Thanks.
Great. Okay, diversity. So I'll try to be fast. I don't know how much time I have. I never have enough time. It's the story of my life. So I think, Justice, did you start? So what are we doing with cities, states, and businesses in the U.S.? So I have put a lot of time into that. I mean, I meet with Administrator Pruitt. I mean, obviously, we have conversations, and I talk about the opportunity of clean growth, and we have there are other agenda items that we're working on. In terms of the subnationals, as we call them in the UN world, we signed an agreement when we were at COP23. Mexico was part of it too, and it was with the U.S. Climate Group. I forget the name, which represented 40% of the U.S. economy, and so we committed to working together. U.S. Climate Alliance. Yep. And so that's like Governor Brown, Jay Inslee, we had the governor of Oregon, so a bunch of states that are committed, and we're going to work together on a variety of issues, whether it's looking at pricing or looking at clean technologies. And with businesses, I do a lot with businesses because I think business has to be part of the conversation. And the good news, they want to be part of the conversation. Business wants certainty. And the last thing they want is us to all go off a cliff, because they lose their value too if we all decide, oh my gosh, we have to act now on climate change and we haven't done anything. And so U.S. businesses are doing a lot. A number of them are part of RE100. So they are committed to 100% renewable energy. So many of them are part of our Powering Past Coal Coalition. On the financing side, I haven't actually spent any time talking about this, but other than saying that we need to change the billions to trillions. So really figuring out, working with financial institutions, the big investors, the big insurance companies, to figure out how to do that. So a lot of action is going on there. And I think that as I say, I mean, that no one knew what the Paris Agreement was, and suddenly there was a big discussion whether the U.S. was going to be in it or out. And I think that actually had the result of folks really saying, okay, wait, we need to be doing action, and they really stepped up. So working closely with them. China. So China, we decided when the U.S. Clearly was taking a different path, that we were going to host what was called the Major Economies Forum. That used to be the U.S. who drove that. That we were going to do with China and the European Union, because it's really important that you get action in advance of COPs, I realized, because you really want to push the agenda so you don't just arrive at the end and everyone's trying to negotiate. And it's a good forum for having discussions about political issues and really getting high-level engagement. So we're doing that with China. China and Canada have a bilateral agreement to cooperate on climate change, everything from pricing to clean technologies. So we're doing we're really doing a lot with China, and I think there's a real opportunity. There's the Belt and Road Initiative. We've certainly been encouraging China to make sure that they're thinking about how they can make it green. We need to be making sure that as we build infrastructure that we're thoughtful about the impacts, the climate impacts. What were the other two?
Carbon price.
So carbon pricing, yes. So carbon pricing it's actually interesting because it's quite organic. Every country has kind of taken a different approach, and even in Canada we have different systems. So British Columbia has had a flat carbon tax that's gone up, and it's revenue neutral, so the money goes back. And then we have cap and trade, so Ontario and Quebec are with cap and trade in California. But the bottom line is to be effective, your price has to go up. And in Canada's context, as I said, we didn't decide that we're going to have a price of $300. We decided that carbon pricing had to fit with the other policy tools that we're using. So, if you're going to do other tools, then, that you can get the same impact. But you need to be looking at this. And our price, as I say, starting at $10 to allow provinces that don't have a price to get there and then go up. In the cap system, your cap has to go down. So, it's different systems, but I think EU gets it. They are reforming their system because it hasn't been as effective as it could be. And there was one more question. Oh, mining. Okay, so this isn't absolutely my area, but yes, we did come up with an ombudsman, I think, and also I'm not sure if we came up with a charter, but obviously how companies behave in other countries is really important, and we want to raise the standards. And I think there's been a lot of good work with Engineers Without Borders in Canada. I used to run a charity, so I worked with those guys. They worked with industry to come up with best practices. There's some companies that are amazing, and then there are some that need to pull up their socks a bit, and so that's really what it's about. And I think that's really important because these are natural resources in another country, another jurisdiction. And I think there's an expectation both from the country that they're operating in, but also from Canadians and our government that you will operate in a sustainable and responsible way. Will it change everything? I think that there's it's every country needs to be coming on board to these standards. But once again, the environment and the economy go together, and I think this is where, as long as you keep that in mind, you will you will figure out policies that will drive the outcome you want. So I think I'm done. I don't know if the people online had anything to say, but I can go check out Twitter afterwards. But I just want to ask you a favor. My job is kind of hard. I can sort of say, environment and economy. But when I look at you, you guys are young. You're motivated. You're studying at a great university in a really important area. I'm going to put a little here, Center on Global Energy and Environment Policy. I'll put a little thing up there. But you're clearly having those conversations. Just continue having them and really push it. Talk to your friends about this and yeah, please talk to your parents and your grandparents. We all need to be working together to figure this out. And the more that we can be talking in a respectful way and thinking about good policies and talking about the opportunities, but also the risks if we don't take action, I think that's where we're going to be able to make a big difference. And, governments come and go. And, that you need to always be thinking about the long term and how do we continue just keep on as people, moving forward and doing smart things because, as I say, I have 3 kids and they're going to have a sustainable future if it kills me. But they're also going to have a good job. So there you go.
So what a great note to end on. And we'll get to thanks in a moment. But let me just pick up on that theme of how to forge consensus and to foster a constructive and serious and well-informed discussion of these issues is exactly why the Center on Global Energy Policy exists. And yes, we do spend a lot of our time thinking about the environmental impacts of energy because they are considerable. Let me mention a couple of events that we have coming up. First of all, a week from today, we will have a session with the chief economist from BP, their energy outlook, which importantly has some very significant updates in how they are projecting the future, the speed of the future for electric vehicles in the transportation sector. At the end of next week, Thursday of next week, we will have an event that focuses on energy, economics, and geopolitics in the Gulf Arab states. We will have an outstanding panel of senior experts that will be visiting with us from the Gulf for that event. And then the third event that I want to highlight picks up on one of the themes that Minister McKenna was just emphasizing, and that is the role of corporations. So we'll have on the 19th of March, another in our series of Where Next on Climate events. This one will focus on responses from America's corporate boardrooms, a project that has been undertaken by Tufts University to do a series of very detailed interviews with colleagues there. And let me also mention some research work that the Center on Global Energy Policy has just released a couple of weeks ago, looking at the question of a carbon tax, a carbon price in the United States. If one were to see discussions of that move ahead, what would be the big questions that would need to be grappled with? And they mirror some of the very same questions that Minister McKenna has alluded to in the Canadian case. Will you please join me in expressing our thanks to Minister McKenna for coming and being such a great example of passionate leadership at the national level and looking out for where we need to go on climate. Thank you.
That was great.